Good afternoon. My name is Joelle Piercy. I'm from Safe and Sound Somerset. I'm here with my coworker Jessica Scoltetti. Safe and Sound Somerset is Somerset County's lead domestic violence response agency. We're here today with our webinar, Recognizing Domestic Violence and Making Referrals. We're reaching out because in the middle of this crisis, of the COVID-19 crisis, we are seeing an escalation of domestic violence. The cases that we're seeing are more intense both in severity and frequency. You'll be seeing some of the impacts our agency has been seeing later on in this presentation, but it's obvious that more than ever before, we need to have more people able to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence and be able to refer people to appropriate services to get them to safety and healing. So a little bit about our organization. We are a private nonprofit, although our work is it is required that we provide a hotline that's mandated. We do have lots of additional services. This is our mission statement, to empower survivors of domestic abuse and engage the community to break the cycle of violence. We've been established in this county for over 40 years. We provide trauma-informed, evidence-based programs that are designed to provide safety, hope, and healing to survivors and their families as they work to build independent lives free from violence and abuse. I'm going to briefly go through our services. As I go through, realize that all of our services are still happening during COVID. We've been able to adjust them so that we're able to provide most of them virtually. To access any of our services, we have a 24-hour call or text hotline. You can either refer people to us, or if you have any questions, if you're interacting with a case or have a case that you're not sure how to process, you're not sure if this is warning signs of abuse, go ahead and talk it out with one of our trained professionals on our hotline. We want you to know that this is a resource for the whole community, not just people experiencing or recovering from domestic violence. So our 24-hour call or text hotline, like I said, is it's accessible for anybody. It does not have caller ID. We get a lot of questions about, if it's safe to call. It can be anonymous. They may ask you your name. You don't have to give it. It also doesn't mean that you're ready to leave a relationship. Lots of people call our hotline, no matter what stage of the relationship they are in, and find that resource helpful for safety planning, for information or guidance. We do have an emergency safe house, a short 30 to 90 day safe house, as well as transitional housing program. To access that, call the hotline. We have extensive counseling and trauma treatment offered at no charge, and it's available for adults and children in group and individual settings. Our domestic violence response teams are teams of volunteers that work closely with our local police departments who meet with victims of domestic violence after police respond to a call and get them connected with support and resources. Legal advocacy teams walk with survivors as they explore restraining order options, and we even have a couple of pro bono lawyers who help us out for more difficult in-depth cases. Because 98 to 99% of domestic violence survivors have had some sort of financial abuse, our Financial Empowerment Center, which also has a new program, Domestic Violence Housing First Initiative, works to meet those financial and housing needs for a survivor, recognizing that those are crucial steps to safety and healing. Family advocacy connects our clients with programs in the community. Our domestic violence liaison, we have a liaison that sits with us for Somerset County and Hunterdon County. They connect our organization with the Department of Child Protection and Permanency, DCPP. They serve as a liaison to interact to support people, again, experiencing domestic violence, and also to provide training for the DCPP staff as well. And then we also have the Speak Outreach and Prevention program that does education events and outreach events in the community, such as this. As we move forward, I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up of what to expect today. We'll be starting off with defining domestic violence and its impacts, understanding how COVID-19 is impacting domestic violence survivors right now, as well as how to recognize and speak to a target of domestic violence. So now I believe I'm going to pass it over to my coworker, Jessica Scoltetti.
Thank you, Joelle. Hello, everyone. So we're here to talk a little bit about how extensive domestic violence is. Over 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience some form of domestic violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. So these are national numbers in America today. Chances are very good that somebody in your life, a client, a community member, wherever you work or you know, there is somebody dealing with this issue. So it's really important to know the warning signs and to understand how to help that person if you can in a safe way. So that's another reason why we're here. 1 in 4 homeless women identify domestic violence as one of the main reasons they are homeless. There's a huge connection between homelessness and domestic violence, as well as many other issues, including you know, having financial issues. Like Joelle mentioned, so many of our survivors are dealing with, you know, higher credit buildup. They have trouble getting housing. So there's all kinds of things that go into that as well. Childhood exposure to domestic violence costs the USA an estimated $55 billion a year. So this study showed that the combined cost of mental and physical health over a lifetime for a child who witnesses domestic violence. This also includes educational attainment. So it's shown that children who witness domestic violence actually don't achieve as high of an education standing as their cohorts, as well as there's all kinds of things that go into that. And that actually also includes wage earning detriment because they don't have as high of an educational standing. So very important to think about that trauma is a lifelong issue. And then finally, up to 84% of domestic violence survivors who seek out domestic violence services exhibit post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So PTSD, about 8 to 10%, I believe that's the current number of United States residents will experience PTSD in their lifetime for some reason, but 84% of domestic violence survivors reaching out are experiencing that. So that told us that we needed to make sure that we could treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm proud to say that Safe and Sound Somerset is one of the only organizations in the country that has some of those modalities right now. So we are treating PTSD at our organization. So going into what is domestic violence, because again, we can't fight this issue or address how many people are dealing with it without knowing what it is, right? So domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another. So this is the definition from the United States Department of Justice. Domestic violence is a crime. So again, it's really important to know that this is the main definition that the law goes by, but we also know that domestic violence has a lot of different facets. So for example, more of the definition, it can take on many forms. It's not just physical, and some of our clients don't even experience physical abuse. Abuse can be emotional, verbal, sexual, financial, digital, or stalking, or a combination of all of these things or some of these things. It can happen in person and online with casual or serious relationships. It also tends to escalate in severity and intensity. That's one of the things that we recommend that you might keep in mind or mention to someone who's dealing with this, who's a survivor or who is in an abusive relationship. You know, tell them that unfortunately abuse does tend to get worse. They may want things to go back to the way they were in the beginning of the relationship, but often that just isn't what happens. So in terms of safety, this is a really important point, this third point here. And finally, abuse can last long after a relationship has ended. In fact, often abusive relationships continue when the abuser, the actor, is in a new relationship with someone else. So that person may still be trying to control and manipulate their ex. So it's really important to have a safety plan for someone to know where they can go, where they feel safe, have roots that are safe from work and school, even after relationship ends. And that's actually a service we offer on our hotline. That's one of the things that we can do with someone is safety plan with them. So going into a little bit more of what abuse looks like. So this is the power and control wheel. It is non-gender, meaning that it applies to everyone. Again, we know that abuse happens to everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. And these are some of the behaviors that someone might see in an abusive relationship, although it's not exhaustive. And I do want to point out what the wheel actually, how it works. So the yellow part on the outside where it says physical and sexual violence, these are the kinds of actions that you might see evidence of, or that might be more visible. But those things don't just happen on their own. They are most often preceded by other actions that happen in a pattern. So those other smaller actions are harder to see. Those are around the middle in the white. So for example, I'm just going to go around the wheel and explain a few of these behaviors. And just so you're aware as well, any of these things happening more than once or in a pattern would be a warning sign of an abusive relationship that, again, can often get worse and continue. So for example, in intimidation at the top, causing fear, slamming things, unfortunately, abuse of pets or showing weapons, those are big warning signs of an abusive relationship. Emotional abuse, so I'm going to the right. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, but putting someone down, making them feel crazy over time, that really affects somebody and can make them question their reality. And we see that a lot. Isolation, this is anything from controlling who somebody speaks to, using jealousy especially is the main one here, using that as an excuse to make someone obey you or not see their support system. Nobody should be just with their partner, right? People have friends and other family and work and school, right? So nobody should be completely cut off, and that's not healthy, right? There's all kinds of things in there. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. This is a large range of behaviors, including making fun of the other person. Oh, I was just joking. It's not a big deal. It's your fault. If you weren't so this or that, I wouldn't have to treat you this way. Saying that same-sex partners cannot abuse each other, that's not true. Actually, the LGBTQ plus community has a higher risk for abuse. So it's really important to note that that's not true. Using children, this is another huge category that we see often. Messing up custody arrangements, using the children against the other partner, threatening them, threatening to call the authorities on, to take the children away. Those are just some of the things that we see. In addition, there's a huge link between, unfortunately, abuse in the household and abuse of children. 30 to 60% of children in homes that are experiencing domestic violence are also experiencing abuse themselves. So really important to know that that's also something that could be happening. Using privilege, this is anything, treating someone like a servant, maybe I make more money than you, so I get to make all the decisions. Putting someone in danger, using the system against you. Some of those are just a few examples. And economic abuse, we already mentioned that 98 to 99% of domestic violence survivors experience a form of economic abuse. And there's a huge range of behaviors there, but just to mention again how important that is to note, that's just one of our main goals at Safe and Sound Somerset, is to help our survivors maintain and gain, financial standing and independence, right? And finally, coercion and threats. This is a range of threats from, making threats to hurt you, I'll hurt the children, I'll hurt myself, threatening to commit suicide, threatening to report to the authorities again, stalking. So all of these things, again, remember, none of these things just happens in a vacuum, right? The physical and emotional, or excuse me, physical and sexual actions, there's usually a pattern of behaviors that lead up to that and continue after that as well.
Mhm.
And that's why this is so devastating, right? This affects someone for their entire life, but it can be healed. So I'm going to pass it back to Joelle.
Absolutely. And while this image is up, Jessica will be talking in a minute about COVID and domestic violence, but just because of this visual is up, we've been hearing a lot of people say COVID-19 is causing domestic violence. And we really want to make it clear that the domestic violence in a lot of times is already there. It may be making it worse. It may be making it more extreme. Maybe there's physical violence where there previously had only been other types of abuse. But generally, you would have seen a lot of these power and control issues even before COVID-19. That's not across the board. There may be instances where abuse totally did just start out of the blue. But we do want to acknowledge that for a lot of these people that are in crisis now, chances are they were already in some level of crisis even before COVID-19, but the pandemic is just making it more extreme as well as cutting them off from possible resources. I do want to touch, because this is a township presentation, I do want to touch on elder abuse. Abuse, there used to be a myth that people would age out of domestic violence, and that is absolutely not the case. In relationship abuse, as well as other types of violence between different family members in the home, or even of other caregivers. So again, domestic violence can still occur with the intimate partner. As they get older, we've had elderly individuals who, for instance, maybe they were hit once or twice when they were 20 years old, and there was never any physical violence, but all those other power and control behaviors and that fear of those couple of incidents was enough to keep them trapped in that relationship. We have also had clients that, for instance, they're being abused by their children, or maybe a niece or nephew, other different family members. And what you'll see is let's see the similar thing. It's this power and control. It's the similar dynamics. You can read through these. You can pause the video, kind of read through them on your own time. You'll see a lot of the similar actions, but just under this guise of now you have an elderly person who might have additional weaknesses or vulnerabilities that someone can take advantage of, especially if they're beginning to lose some of their thought processes. It's easier for people to again exploit those vulnerabilities and gain more power and control. There'll be resources listed at the end, including the Somerset County hotline where you can report elder abuse. But do know we have dealt with elderly clients that have been abused by other family members besides intimate partner. So please know that you can also use us as a resource for some of that as well. I do want to touch upon gaslighting. This is, if I asked our clinicians at the organization, the one thing they wanted us to talk about in terms of emotional abuse, this is what they said. They said it's the hardest to identify. You'll see some warning signs here, but it's basically when someone's twisting words or twisting reality. So it's really hard for someone to figure out what's really happening, and really begin to question their own reality. So some of these examples, or at least red flags, if you're interacting with someone and they're constantly questioning, like, well, I don't know what I did wrong. I don't understand why they're always so upset. Or they said I did this because I was angry, but I wasn't really angry. So assigning them motives that they weren't really intending. Also, you might see people talk very slowly and methodically and very carefully. They're editing every word so that nothing can possibly be turned against them, right? Gaslighting tends to happen slowly, so that the target doesn't realize what's happening. And so it just gradually gets slower and slower. If all of a sudden you turned one day to, well, the sky is green, right? No one's going to look up at the sky and think it's green, right away. But it's you slowly, you begin to slowly turn their words against them. So maybe they think, oh my gosh, am I seeing it wrong? Am I vision wrong? Right? It slowly builds up to that point where even some of the most absurd things, it's hard to discern whether or not that's real, or whether or not, in this case, the abuse is actually happening. It tends to be mixed in with positive reinforcement. That tends to be one of the strongest ways to gain power and control over someone is mix in some of those good times. Very frequently, you'll have people say, but there are so many good times mixed in. Flowers, they apologize. Some of you, if you've received trainings before, you might have heard about it being a cycle. We don't actually use the cycle anymore because we found it wasn't universally applicable. But what was universally applicable is that these positive times, these good times, were then turned against that person as a way to say, well, I was good to you, so why are you imagining this? You're making this up. Obviously, things can't be that bad because I was good to you. So they use those good times as a way to continue that manipulation. So it fits into that power and control wheel, as opposed to it being a separate part of a cycle. It's really still part of gaining power and control and manipulating someone. And these here on the right are just some additional signs and different types of actions.
So we're going to talk about the impact of the pandemic, COVID-19, on domestic violence. We've been referring to it throughout the presentation, but we at Safe and Sound Somerset in Somerset County have seen a 35% increase in our hotline calls and texts. That's huge. That's from last year, same time. 50% more referrals to DVRT, which is our domestic violence response teams that work closely with the police departments in the aftermath of a domestic violence situation, and they work directly with our survivors. So again, that should tell you that crises are happening, and they're happening more. The violence is more intense, which we'll talk about in a minute. 25% more referrals to counseling at our organization. So people are looking for a way to safety plan, to talk, to heal, right? And finally, this stat always gets me. Statewide, 500%, there's been a 500% increase in people accessing safe shelter services. So every county in New Jersey has a domestic violence organization, a domestic violence response organization. So we have seen collectively a 500% increase. And again, our services are still operating during the pandemic, even now in November 2020. So really important to note how much this is increasing. And again, as Joelle said, remember that most of the time COVID-19 is not starting domestic abuse. Those abusive behaviors were already there. So we do want to talk about a few of the examples that we and the National Domestic Violence Hotline have seen during this crisis. And again, you can look for these signs within your clients and your coworkers and your family and friends, right? So first of all, threats and emotional abuse, using COVID-19 to manipulate, saying, maybe threatening to cough on someone, getting them sick, oh, I was just joking. We kind of mentioned that before, telling them they can't go anywhere, convincing them the police won't help them. There's nowhere to go because you'll get the virus, right? Financial abuse. We've heard examples of people stealing stimulus checks, forcing someone to quit their job because you'll get sick, preventing somebody from conducting a Zoom meeting. So there's abuse going on if people are working from home. A good reminder, again, to look out not just for your clients, for who you serve in the community, but also for your coworkers. All of these signs are present still today, the signs we talked about on the power and control wheel. Another one using, the violence. So violence can occur privately now. Nobody can see the bruises or effects. It's really important to note that before the stay-at-home orders, people were going out and, seeing people and going about their normal routines. And right now, there's no escaping that, right? If people are staying at home and they have to, right? There's no way to escape the violence and the threat of violence. So unfortunately, that's the case not only for abusive relationships amongst adults, but also children. And then going into using children, refusing to abide by custody agreements because of COVID. using COVID as an excuse to and threatening the children, maybe even calling someone a bad parent when a child misbehaves. You know, children are going through extreme stress and trauma right now. We're all dealing with a collective trauma. The whole society, we all experience it in different ways, but you know, a parent who is manipulating their children and making it the other parent's fault, you know, that's a warning sign. Um, and then isolation, as you may already know, isolation has increased for everybody, but for people who are experiencing the threat of violence and abuse, this cannot be understated. So for example, you can't go to your parents, you can't call your friends, you can't go anywhere. Just using the isolation to threaten someone, to hurt them, right? To actually physically hurt them. And again, they're blaming all of this on the virus. It's the virus's fault, right? So really important to note that, you know, an abuser can use the fear of the virus to threaten and control in this relationship. And that can make violence increase. And again, sometimes our clients don't experience physical violence, but the threat of that happening is just as concerning, right? So we need to make sure that we are looking for these warning signs. At this point, we're going to talk about what are some of the signs that someone is in an abusive relationship. So this goes for any time, not just during COVID.
All right, so some of the signs, and now again, because a lot of times you're doing things over the phone right now, so you're going to be listening to the language that they're using, how they're talking. So feel like they're going crazy. They're not really sure. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe things, you know, maybe they do deserve what's happening for them. You know, just this constant feeling of I'm not really sure what's going on. Maybe I do deserve this. Maybe, and a kind of a hopelessness. It's not going to get better. If you're talking with someone and they're worried about texting their partner back right away, or they're worried that their partner's going to overhear them on the phone. Oh no, they can't hear me talking to somebody or they'll think I'm cheating on them. Or just, I have to get off the phone right away. They'll be upset if I'm talking to you. Just kind of picking up for those signals of fear. If they're making excuses for their partner, oh, they were hungry, they're tired, if they're drunk, you know, alcohol may make violence worse, or sometimes there may only be physical violence. But similar to COVID, you're still going to be seeing those other power and control behaviors, even when someone's sober. And the other thing is, even if someone's under the influence, it's still not an excuse for that behavior. It's still not an acceptable reason. That behavior is still wrong. They also may be convinced they can change their partner. Maybe that person had their own traumas. At Safe and Sound, we say trauma breeds trauma, or hurt people hurt. And there may be real, you know, sad, valid traumas in that person's life that may be contributing to the reasons why they're using violence. But we let people know that it's still not an excuse, and it is very hard for that abuse to stop without that person taking full responsibility and getting help to address the reasons why they're abusing in the first place. If they're talking about avoiding hanging out with their friends, or having or saying that their partner says that their parents don't like them, their family doesn't like them, their partner's using that as a way to prevent them from seeing that person. If they talk about past injuries, you know, maybe they all of a sudden mention a broken arm or they were at the hospital, but then they totally excuse away what happened. It was no big deal. You know, I may have broken my arm, but it's no big deal. Or they tend to make excuses that just don't quite make sense with the injury they're talking about. The other warning sign is police frequently called to the home. We do want to be mindful, though, that at least 50% of people never ever report the abuse to police. So don't think that if it's not there, if police aren't called, that it's not an abusive relationship. But just if they are frequently called to the home, it can be a warning sign that someone's going on. And unfortunately, in a lot of those instances, police will tell you that, you know, they're going to the same houses all the time, and these are some of the most dangerous calls that police officers go on because they are so unpredictable. So what should you keep in mind if you're speaking to a target of abuse? So first of all, I want you to think, before we move forward, I want you to think of all the myths or or expectations or assumptions you've heard about domestic violence. I'm going to list off a few and think if you've heard about these things. Domestic violence only happens in that other community, in that other, people of that background or that income level or that language, or in that town. Doesn't happen here. If they don't leave, it can't be that bad. Or if it's not physical, then it's not abuse. Or domestic violence is a family issue. It's not that bad. Or it takes two to tango. If they're hurt, they probably did something to deserve it, right? It's their fault. Or if it's a man, they're weak. If they let their partner do that to them, they're weak. That's probably the kindest word I've heard people use sometimes in that thought process. So I want you to think about all those myths, all those assumptions you've heard. And the reality is it can happen to anywhere and anyone and anywhere, and it is serious. And it's no one's fault that they're being treated this way. However, if you've heard this, the people in those relationships have heard it as well. So that's the first thing you should keep in mind if you're speaking to a target of domestic violence. They've heard that. A lot of times they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they're very scared. And it is hard for them to reach out, a lot of times because of those assumptions. A lot of times they even begin to feel it about themselves as well. So what if you start to hear these warning signs? So how to approach the topic. This is a term called couching in the counseling world. And this is a good way to bring up a difficult topic. It also is a good way to refer people. And I'll talk about how to do that in a second. So the first thing you do is you tell them you're concerned. And then list the reasons that you're asking the question. So it doesn't come out of the blue. So they begin to think about it as you're listing those reasons. You want to normalize it a bit. Say, it's no big deal. I'm asking this question. This happens to people. And then you want to ask them a specific question. So as an example, I've been listening to you. You've mentioned that your partner doesn't let you work, won't let you see your family members. List those reasons. Then you want to normalize it a little bit and explain why you're asking this question. Oftentimes, these are signs for people that a relationship has become abusive. And then you want to ask a specific question because they may not know what domestic violence or abusive means. So you want to ask specifically, are you feeling safe in your relationship? This is also a good way to kind of a couch referral to organization. You've mentioned these things, and sometimes when people are experiencing these things, they find it really helpful to safety plan with an organization. Is this something you might be interested in? A resource you might be interested in? And then you kind of normalize it a little bit more. You don't have to leave the relationship. It's just a free resource available for you to safety plan and talk something out. So this is a good way to approach it if you're concerned, but it's also a good way to refer somebody. If someone discloses abuse, we ask that you believe them. Remember, they are coming in with all these preconceived ideas about domestic violence, about people's response and attitudes towards domestic violence. So the most helpful thing you can do is believe them. There may be a point, and maybe unfortunately it might be your job, or not unfortunately, but it may be your job in that moment. You do have to be a fact finder, but mostly that's not the case, unless generally you're a police officer, you're in the court. But generally, you don't need to be a fact finder. So believe them and refer them to services. Establish safety. First, make sure that it's safe that they're talking to you. If there are partners in the room, it could be dangerous. Assume that they could be monitoring it. So make sure they're safe to talk with you. And then recommend that if they stay in the relationship, they can still safety plan. The safety planning we do is how do you fight safely? What rooms do you avoid that might be more dangerous? Code words with kids to go to the next door neighbors if things get too dangerous. Having the car, backed into a driveway so they can leave quickly. Having it loaded with gas. Having a grab and go bag. So even if they stay in the relationship, there's ways to do it safely. And then if they want to leave and have a plan. So those are all the different types of safety planning we do. And again, I can't stress enough, it is confidential, it is anonymous. We don't have caller ID if they call us. No one's going to find out. And again, if they want to stay in the relationship, if they've left the relationship already, if they want to leave the relationship or the relationship was long ago, they can still call us. Couch referral to organization. We're Somerset County. If you happen to be working with somebody else from a different county, there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and they will connect people with their local organization. But if they call us, we will also we'll establish safety with them and then connect them with their local organization. Again, avoid making judgments. It can take an average of 7 to 15 times trying to relieve a relationship before they end that relationship for good. Um, it's, maybe there's threats that they haven't heard of. It's can be hard to find housing. It can be hard to find a job, especially if there's been financial abuse before. The fear of parenting alone, the fear of community response. There are so many reasons. And the other thing is the single most dangerous time for an abusive relationship is as it's ending. So think about gaining power and control as a scale. In a healthy relationship, you've got a pretty equal scale. People may have different roles, but they're both equal to safety. They both are equal to respect and making decisions for themselves and feeling safe. But if someone's gaining power and control, that scale shifts. But if someone's about to leave, in the eyes of the person using the violence, who thinks they're up higher, all of a sudden they feel like they've lost that power and control. And so they tend to go to more extremes to try to gain that power and control back. So that's why you'll often see maybe someone try to leave, then things get worse and scarier, and then they go back to try to calm things down a little bit. So you'll see that give and take a lot. But and then again, just the difficulty of establishing independence, especially if they don't have the financial resources to do so after years of abuse. What are some other things to keep in mind? And we're nearing the end of the presentation. Avoid recommending marriage counseling because it can actually, if the abuse isn't addressed and if the marriage counselor isn't aware of domestic violence, it can actually be used as another avenue for abuse and trying to convince the target of abuse that they're going crazy. The anger management can actually make the abuser a better abuser because they're able to control their feelings more, which makes it easier to manipulate the other person. It makes it harder for the target of abuse to figure out what's real, what's not, what's abuse, and what's anger. It can make it harder to do that. So again, the first step is getting them to safety and so that they can make the best decisions in a safe way for their relationship. Avoid asking questions that indicate they are at fault. Why don't you just leave? What did you do or not do? The question is, what do you need right now? And how can I help you get there? That's the question you need to ask. We can help with the rest. Once you get them to the services, we can help them with the rest of the journey to safety. It's just making that initial call. Avoid suggesting they should talk to their partner. Again, this could put them in greater danger. We always say that the survivor knows the relationship the best. The best thing you can do, again, is get them to professionals who can safety plan. We want to stress, be honest about your limits of confidentiality. If you hear of the child being in a dangerous situation, remember that everyone in New Jersey is a mandatory reporter if they suspect child abuse or neglect. Generally, domestic violence in the home by itself isn't a cause for referral, but if there's any danger posed to the child. But again, because of that huge overlap, it's better to be of domestic violence and child abuse and neglect. It's better to be safe and sorry. If you're concerned for the child, make a report. Okay, and be honest again about your limits of confidentiality. Because we have that liaison now between DCPP and our organization, they really do an excellent job of supporting survivors and really getting them the support they need to begin to live a life free of abuse. So in summary, if you're talking with someone and you're concerned or they disclose abuse, again, stress that research shows abuse escalates in frequency and intensity. Change is possible, but it's very hard, and it needs the actor to take full responsibility to address the root causes of the abuse. It usually just doesn't go away. Everyone deserves to be treated equally in their relationships, no matter what mistakes they've made in their past. They don't deserve physical abuse or to be unequal and some other emotional abuse as well. You don't have to end a relationship in order to make a safety plan, and because that help is available. The other thing I haven't mentioned is document. If they decide they're going to seek a restraining order, documentation is helpful. It's also just really helpful for that individual person. Remember, so much of the abuse is convincing them that it's not happening, it's not real, they deserve it. So by documenting it, even if just short, quick notes or short screenshots, can help that target of abuse see what really is happening to them. It can kind of ground them a little bit and help them realize that maybe they would benefit from talking to somebody. I also want to stress people in crisis may not be able to process all the information. and not just for DV information, but any of the information you give them. So, keep repeating. You never know when you're going to make a difference. And I really want to stress this idea of planting the seed. You may not be able to see the difference you're making right now, but just planting the seed by talking about it. And, people ask all the time, well, what can I do? What can I do about this topic? And the number one thing we say is just talk about it. Think about those myths and assumptions that people have heard. So many people are scared to talk about it. So many people don't have the information. And now with COVID, it is harder for them to get that information. Maybe they used to go somewhere they might see our poster, but now they're going to that place anymore and they won't see our flyer. So talk about it with clients, include it in emails. Mention at the end of a phone chat with somebody, hey, there's this organization if you feel unsafe. Not only are you potentially giving someone information that they can use, but you're also establishing yourself as a safe place for that person to go to if they do need help. So by talking about it, you create the environment that makes it possible for survivors to come forward, even if they're so isolated right now. Any connection you have, make it an opportunity that someone who needs help knows it's a safe way to get help. So I think that's it. So right now, here's a list of resources. Again, you can pause the video to look through, but I listed our hotline number again, as well as our safety planning resources, which people can download and use, as well as the Adult Protective Services, the Child Abuse Hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Because we talked about the fact that a person who uses violence may threaten self-harm or suicide, I also include the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. We can also do more customized or specific trainings. For instance, we do trainings on children and domestic violence, a trauma training. We can do a lot more in-depth dives, for special groups. If you, for instance, the police, we have a training for police. We do trainings at places of worship. So special groups, feel free to fill out that form and we're happy to set something up. Here are our references. But again, thank you so much for being here. And if you have any questions at all, you feel free to reach out to our hotline, 866-685-1122. Thank you so much.